The Price of Prejudice, Chapter 1. The Classroom Divide. James Carter sat in the back of his high school classroom, his dark brown eyes scanning the pages of his textbook, while the rest of the students chatted away. He had always been a quiet, thoughtful kid, preferring to observe rather than engage. But at Westwood High, a prestigious school in a wealthy suburb of Atlanta, he often felt like an outsider. It wasn't just because he was one of the few black students in his AP history class. It was the way his teacher, Mrs. Linda Whitmore, looked at him like he didn't belong. Miss Whitmore was a middle-aged woman with icy blue eyes and a sharp tongue. She carried herself with an air of superiority, and though she rarely said anything outright racist, her actions spoke volumes. She would call on every student in the room except James. When he did raise his hand, she'd pretend not to see it. And on the rare occasions she acknowledged his presence, she'd speak to him in a condescending tone, as if expecting him to fail. James had learned to ignore it. He was here to learn, not to make friends with his teacher, but everything changed the day they started discussing the civil rights movement. Chapter 2. A Lesson in Hate. The classroom was unusually quiet as Miss Whitmore stood at the front, writing Civil Rights Movement 1950 S 1960 S. On the board. This was a period of great change in American history, she began. Many African Americans fought for equal rights, led by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. However, not all of their methods were effective. Some people believed James could already tell where this was going, that African Americans at the time exaggerated their struggles. Many of the so-called injustices were simply a product of their own lack of effort. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded along, taking notes. James clenched his fists. Miss Whitmore, he said, keeping his voice steady. Are you saying segregation and racism weren't real problems? She turned to him, her lips curling slightly. I'm saying that perhaps if people had worked harder, instead of demanding handouts, things would have been different. A few students gasped. Others snickered. James felt heat rise in his chest. That's not true, he said firmly. Black people weren't given the same opportunities. They were— Oh, please, she interrupted. Don't play the victim, James. If you spent as much time studying as you do complaining, maybe you wouldn't be struggling in this class. A wave of silence swept over the room. James wasn't struggling. He had an A in history. But that wasn't the point. Miss Whitmore smirked, as if daring him to say more. James gritted his teeth. He wasn't going to let her get to him. But then she said something that made his blood run cold. You people always make excuses. The room froze. A few students exchanged nervous glances. James felt his heart pound. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat had gone dry. Miss Whitmore turned back to the board, acting as if nothing had happened. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Visitor. That night, James told his father what had happened. His father, Richard Carter, listened carefully, his face unreadable. He was a tall, imposing man in his mid-40s, with a commanding presence that made people listen when he spoke. A former military officer turned high-powered attorney, he had built a reputation as one of the most feared civil rights lawyers in the state. After hearing everything, he simply said, "I'll take care of it." The next morning, James walked into class feeling anxious. He didn't know what his father planned, but he had a feeling Miss Whitmore was about to get a wake-up call. And he was right. Midway through the lesson, the classroom door swung open. Every head turned as Richard Carter stepped inside. He was dressed in a crisp navy suit, his expression calm but authoritative. Ms. Whitmore went pale for the first time. James saw something he never expected: fear in her eyes. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. Excuse me, Miss Whitmore, Richard said smoothly. I'd like to have a word with you. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She swallowed hard. I'm in the middle of teaching, she stammered. Richard gave a polite smile. Oh, don't worry. I won't take much of your time. He turned to the class. I just need to address something very important. Something about racism in education. A murmur spread through the students. I'm Richard Carter, he continued, looking directly at Miss Whitmore. I'm a civil rights attorney. And I was very interested to hear about the comments made in this classroom yesterday, Miss. Whitmore's hands trembled slightly. I didn't say anything wrong, Richard tilted his head. Didn't you? He pulled out his phone. Because my son recorded the entire conversation, the color drained from her face. James hadn't actually recorded anything. But his father didn't need to tell her that. The mere suggestion was enough. I'd like to remind you, Miss Whitmore, that educators are held to a standard of fairness and professionalism. And what you said yesterday wasn't just unprofessional. It was discriminatory. She opened her mouth. But no sound came out. If this is how you treat black students, I have to wonder how many other children have suffered under your teaching. Richard's voice was calm but sharp as a blade. I plan on taking this to the school board, and possibly the press. The room was deathly silent. Ms. Whitmore looked around, realizing that every single student was watching. She had lost control. I'm sorry, she finally whispered. Richard didn't smile. You're sorry you got caught. She flinched. I expect a formal apology to my son, he continued. And I expect you to reflect on whether you truly belong in this profession, Miss. Whitmore nodded quickly, her eyes darting to the door, as if hoping to escape. Richard turned to James. Let's go. James rose from his seat, his heart pounding. He had never seen his father in action before, not like this. As they left the classroom, whispers erupted behind them. Chapter 5. Justice served. By the end of the week, Miss Whitmore had been placed on administrative leave. A full investigation was launched, and soon, other students came forward with their own stories. It turned out James wasn't the only one she had treated unfairly. A month later, she resigned. James never saw her again. But he learned something that day, something his father had always told him, but he hadn't fully understood until now. Silence allows injustice to thrive. And sometimes, the best way to fight back is to make sure the world is watching.